After a while he no longer felt the headache. In his heart he was even more impressed by Xuanhuan's massage technique. In just a few days her massage technique had actually improved by leaps and bounds. It was also at this moment that he finally felt that something was wrong. When the servant girl was by his side she would not stop nagging. She would always talk about some daily things. Why was she so quiet today? Moreover, in order to drive away mosquitoes, the servant girl had been wearing Rui recently. There was always a mint smell around her, but it should not be this faint fragrance. Instead, it seemed that Rui had reached a certain level of martial arts. Their bodies naturally emitted a kind of momentum. Mosquitoes did not dare to approach them, and they rarely used Rui's lotion. The three women in the family each had their own merits. Li had lived with them for so long, of course he was very familiar with their unique smell. A familiar figure had already appeared in his mind. Li hurriedly opened his eyes and saw Lu Rui standing behind him. She was stretching out her hand to massage his temples. In other words, from the start she had been massaging him all along. Wife, why? Li was surprised and was about to stand up. Lu Rui shook her head and said, Husband, just lie down like this. This is what I should do. Li could enjoy Xuanhuan's massage with a clear conscience, but if it was Lu Rui he would feel a little strange. Neither of them spoke, and the atmosphere became quiet again. Actually, I have something that I have always been curious about. After a moment, a gentle voice finally reached Li Yi's ears. After being startled for a moment he said, Wife, there's no harm in saying it. Lu Rui looked at him with a trace of curiosity in her beautiful eyes. This was also a question that she had hidden in her heart for a long time. When husband first came to the stronghold, why did you not think of running away? She finally asked this question. With that her gaze stopped on Li Yi's face. A normal person who was caught by Rui and the others should have tried to escape, but he seemed to have accepted his fate from the beginning. If he was a weak scholar who did not dare to fight back when he was bullied, it would be understandable. But after these days of interaction, Lu Rui could see that although he looked like a weak scholar on the surface, there was an unyielding spirit in his bones. It was impossible for him to accept his fate. If I said that it was because I could eat and stay here for free and picked up a beautiful wife for free, and even had a servant to serve me, would you believe me? Li Yi raised his head and looked into her eyes as he said with a smile. The expression on Lu Rui's pretty face froze for a moment, then she also bloomed into a smile. Since husband said so, I will naturally believe you. Perhaps even Lu Rui herself did not realize that after hearing Li Yi's words, she finally heaved a sigh of relief that had been in her heart for a long time. In the autumn afternoon a light breeze blew, and the courtyard was actually a little chilly. Lu Rui combed her hair that had been messed up by the wind. As she listened to Li Yi talk about what happened that day, the corners of her mouth involuntarily curled into a charming smile. Wife, you don't know. That old man is very fierce. If you were caught by him that day, you would not have been able to wait for Rui and the others. Why did they catch you, husband? Who knows? Old people are getting old and their brains might not be working well, just like second great uncle. Husband, lower your voice. Second great uncle's hearing is very good. Second great uncle's hearing? Ah. Amidst Li Yi's slightly disdainful mockery, the old man who was lying comfortably on a rocking chair and basking in the sunset a few courtyards opened his eyes lazily. He looked in a certain direction and the corners of his mouth twitched. He turned over and continued to sleep. Little brat, the old voice did not leave the courtyard but disappeared in the wind. Chapter 133. Why didn't you go back to take a look these days? Back to where? To the place where you used to live. Li Yi smiled and said, There's no one at home. It's just a house now. It's not important whether I go back or not. Li Yi had only laid in that house for a while. He didn't even have time to step into the house a second time before he fled the village. Brought here by Lu Rui, he had no memories of the past in his head. He naturally had no feelings for the village and the place he used to live. In comparison, this place was more like a home. Lu Rui thought of what he had just said. She looked at him and asked, Did you also not have enough to eat in the past? Li Yi nodded. Just by looking at the house, he knew that the original owner of this body was only a poor scholar. Lu Rui asked with some confusion, You are so talented and know how to do business. Why did you also have to go hungry? These days, talented scholars didn't have to worry about food and clothing. According to Rui, when he wrote a poem, even the famous scholars in Qing and Prefecture were scared. Countless young ladies and rich ladies fought to invite him. Lu Rui couldn't understand why such a person would worry about making a living. What's more, whether it was candied haws or Rui nectar, they were all good things that could make money. Just the banknotes Li Yi asked her to keep these days were probably enough for an ordinary family to spend for a lifetime. Li Yi looked at her and said with some teasing, "These two have nothing to do with each other. Talent can't be used to make a living. But martial arts can. My wife's martial arts are so high. If you were a bandit, I'm afraid you would be able to easily steal food. Wouldn't you still live a hard life?" Lu Rui smiled and said, "In fact, I also thought about it. At that time, I just wanted to take Rui and Xiaohuan to eat. I didn't care about other things. If I really reached that level, I'm afraid it's not impossible for me to go that far like you said." A bandit chief who didn't want to be a bandit was not a good chief. Although he was nominally the husband of the chief, he couldn't compare with the real bandit chief. With a wave of his arm, except for Fong and the others, no one responded. Willow Village might as well be called Willow Village or Willow Village. What a waste of this name. At present, it seemed that the man who wanted to be a bandit king, his dream had to be put aside for the time being. If one day Li Xian's relatives couldn't force him to live anymore, he could consider rebelling against him. He could open a great mountain road and conquer the mountains one by one. When he had wealth, fame and power, he could bury all the treasures in the mountains. He could say to the outside world, "Do you want my treasures? I've buried them in the depths of the mountains." From then on, countless people with dreams rushed into the mountains. The Jing kingdom officially stepped into the chaotic world of mountain bandits. History called it the era of mountain bandits. My husband, my husband." Seeing that Li Yi suddenly fell into a daze, Lu Rui stretched out her hand and waved it in front of his eyes. Li Yi came back to his senses and looked at Lu Rui. He asked, "Besides being a bandit, what other dreams did you have?" Other people would usually talk about their dreams when they were courting girls. After they got the girl, they would be too lazy to talk about these things. Li Yi was the opposite. He didn't expect that she, who had always been gentle, actually had the idea of being a bandit. Shouldn't this be something that only Mississippi Lu would think about? Dreams? Lu Rui thought for a while and said, "I thought about opening a martial arts school before. This was actually my father's wish. Unfortunately, although we weren't poor at that time, we didn't have much spare money. We couldn't afford the expenses of opening a martial arts school. After my father left, I didn't think about it anymore. My wife, if you want to do it, just do it. The money is just sitting there. It should be enough to open a martial arts school." Li Yi thought for a while and said, "If it's not enough, wait for a few more days. At that time, it won't be a problem to open 5, 6, 7 or 8 martial arts schools, let alone one." Lu Rui shook her head and said, "My father has always wanted to spread the Lu family's martial arts. I don't think so far ahead. I have nothing to do now. Teaching a few children can be considered as fulfilling one of his wishes." Since it was his father-in-law's last wish, Li Yi had to be a little more attentive and keep this matter in mind. After a few words, the topic changed. Although the two often talked before, it was the first time they had such a happy conversation like today. From the beginning, they treated each other with respect, like a strange but important friend. But now they could joke around without any scruples. In the courtyard, Li Yi lay on the chair. Lu Rui continued to use her unique technique to help him massage. Both of them had a faint smile on their faces. When Lu Rui walked in from outside, she had already seen some of the appearances of a real husband and wife. Her footsteps stopped at the door. After a moment of daze, she silently retreated. If it wasn't for Li Xian coming to bid farewell and ruining the rare time for the two of them, today would have been a perfect day. When they left, Li Xian looked at Li Yi with an extremely shocked expression. He asked in an incredulous tone, "That little servant girl said that the ground we are stepping on is actually a big ball. Is this true?" "Yes." Seeing Li Yi nod with absolute certainty, Li Xian's expression became somewhat dazed again. Xuanhuan was still a young girl. Once something happened, she could not wait to share it with others. However, when she told the other sisters about the things son-in-law told her, no one believed her. They even said how could son-in-law say such silly things, and Xuanhuan must have made it up to make them laugh. Now, after much difficulty, she finally found a person who was willing to listen to her and would not think that she was lying. The little servant girl told Li Xian all the unimaginable things that Li Yi told her when he was free. Li Xian now understood a principle. When something was different from what he thought, he should not be in a hurry to deny it. Only after he personally went to verify it, then he had the right to speak. But what kind of method did he have to go through to find out whether the ground they were stepping on was round or not? Several guards left with Li Xian. Fong and several men in the workshop also went down the mountain with them. The toilet water workshop in the city had been built. As technical consultants, Fong and others needed to personally guide them and train the workers sent to the toilet water workshop so that they could start work this morning. Remember, as long as no one is killed, you can do whatever you want. I only want the formula of the ruidu. At the foot of the mountain, in a dense forest, more than 10 masked figures in black were lurking there. A young voice commanded in a deep voice. Chapter 134. You refuse a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit. I'd like to see if the formula or my life is more important. The young man looked towards a certain direction outside the forest with a vicious look on his face. He had wanted to buy the formula of the ruidu at a low price, but he did not expect the shopkeeper to be so unappreciative and chase them out of the shop after a few words. Later on, his scheme was seen through by the shopkeeper and he failed again. Instead, his brother-in-law, who was a county lieutenant, became fearful and stopped providing him with any help. Seeing that the business of the ruidu was booming, if he did not act now, he could only watch as the mountains of silver slipped away before his eyes. He had already sent people to find out that every morning, they would bring the ruidu to the shop in the prefectural city. The shop would close at noon, and the shopkeeper would rent a carriage from the carriage shop to leave the prefectural city. This was the road that they had to pass. Since the soft approach did not work, he could only use the hard approach. He would intercept them on the road and force them to reveal the formula. When the time came, he would not be afraid that the shopkeeper would not speak. The men he hired were all scoundrels in the prefectural city. Each of them was good at fighting and they were paid to do things. How could they not deal with a weak scholar? This time, even if the burly man was present, there was nothing for him to worry about. 2 fists were no match for 4 hands, and he had dozens of hands on his side. Even if the other party reported the matter to the authorities, the person in charge of arresting robbers in Anshi County was his brother-in-law, so naturally the authorities would not investigate him. Moreover, there were many cases that could not be solved every year, so one more wouldn't make a difference. From the beginning to the end, he did not show himself, so the authorities would not be able to trace him. Of course, just in case he could not open the shop in Qing'an Prefecture. The capital was a good place, and if he opened a few shops there, his business would probably be even better. Just as the young man was planning his beautiful future in his heart, a horse carriage slowly approached from afar. The carriage that they were waiting for was supposed to come from the direction of the prefecture city, but this carriage was heading in the opposite direction. The young man didn't pay much attention to it at first, but when he glanced to the side and saw a certain burly man walking in front of the carriage, his expression froze. Then he immediately said in a low voice, "All of you stay alert. When the carriage in front comes over, your targets will be the people in the carriage." And the man in the front beat him up. The dozen or so people hiding in the forest were all dressed in black, with half of their faces covered by a black cloth. They were leaning loosely against the tree, but after hearing the young man's words, they slightly raised their spirits, hid their bodies and looked outside. The carriage continued to move forward slowly. A few figures followed behind the carriage at a steady pace. Among these people, the burly man in the lead was rather eye-catching. He was also the one that the employer had taken special care of just now. These people remembered his appearance in their hearts, so that when they took action later, they could take care of him appropriately. As for the others, they didn't seem to pose much of a threat to them. They had a huge advantage in numbers and they were all very confident in their own skills, so they didn't think much of these people. Inside the carriage, Li Xian sat on the soft cushion, still thinking about a certain problem. If the ground beneath their feet was a big ball, then wouldn't the people on the other side of the ball fall into it? Then, an even more complicated problem surfaced in his mind. If they really fell, where would they fall to? When he thought about this, Li Xian knew that he couldn't continue thinking about it. This was already far beyond the scope of his understanding. Whoosh! The voice of the guard driving the carriage was heard, and the carriage suddenly came to an abrupt stop. Li Xian's body staggered, and he lifted the curtains of the carriage. He frowned and asked, "What happened? Why did we stop?" "Young master, stay in the carriage and don't come out. Something is not right in front," the guard driving the carriage said in a deep voice. Fong and the leader of the guards walked at the front, and when they looked at a certain dense forest on the side of the road, they frowned at the same time. The trees in the forest weren't thick and they couldn't hide some people's bodies. Wearing black clothes and hiding in the forest in broad daylight, these people didn't look normal no matter how they looked at it. In the forest, seeing the carriage stop there, the people around the carriage also looked over. One of the men in black said with some suspicion, "Could it be that they found us?" "Impossible, we clearly wore black clothes." "But, it's daytime now." As soon as someone spoke, the surrounding atmosphere suddenly became awkward. The young man's face was a little hot, because he was the one who gave the order to wear black clothes and cover their faces. Didn't those novels always say the same thing? Now wasn't the time to worry about this. Originally, he wanted to wait for them to pass by and catch them off guard, but he didn't expect to be discovered so quickly. Since this was the case, of course there was no need to hide anymore. A trace of determination flashed on the young man's face, and he suddenly waved his hand and said, "Go!" Fong and the other guards watched as the masked men in black rushed out of the forest. Their roars were louder than the previous one, but they were all empty-handed and had no weapons on them. The expressions on their faces were a little surprised. However, since these people were coming for them, of course they couldn't be polite. The 4 people stayed to guard the carriage, while Fong, the leader of the guards, and the other 2 people went to meet the men in black. Because they had just received the young man's order, a small half of the dozen or so men in black rushed toward the carriage, while the other half headed toward Lao Fong and the others. A voice was heard saying, "Let's get rid of that man first." The man they were talking about was naturally Fong. As the employer's focus on the surface, he also seemed to be the biggest threat to them. Immediately, half of the men rushed to him. The leader of the guards was stunned when he saw this. Half of the men actually rushed to that guy and the other half to deal with the 3 of them. Wasn't this obviously looking down on them? The winner of the battle between the 2 people had not been decided yet, but in these people's eyes, it was obvious that the man surnamed Fong was stronger than them. This could not be tolerated. The leader of the guards coldly snorted, and directly rushed to the half of the men in black who were rushing to Fong. "These people are mine." Of course, Fong was not to be outdone. He suddenly stamped his feet and his speed suddenly increased a little. In the blink of an eye, he had already rushed to the group of men in black. The remaining 2 guards could only watch as their leader and the burly man surnamed Fong displayed their invincible might. They were like tigers that had entered a flock of sheep. Their actions were straightforward and efficient. In just a few breaths of time, the black-clothed men fell to the ground one after another. None of them could stand up again. "I have 3. I also have 3. The 2 of them looked up at the same time and with fierce eyes, they looked at the other half of the men in black who were scared stiff. They coldly snorted at the same time and rushed over again. The 2 guards heard banging sounds from time to time, and they thought that every punch must have landed on flesh. The 2 of them were stunned and did not dare to rush forward to help. Looking at the posture of the 2 men, if the 2 of them went forward they might also kill the 2 of them. They wanted to go to the other side to help, but when they turned their heads, they found that the battle around the carriage had also ended. The 4 people were still guarding the carriage and the ground was covered with men in black. Bang! With a karate chop, Fong knocked out the last man in black. When he looked up, he found that the leader of the guards had already rushed to the direction of the forest. "You don't come over." Seeing that the people he had brought with him had fallen to the ground one by one, a look of horror finally appeared on the young man's face. He saw the fierce man approaching him step by step, and as he retreated, he said with a trembling voice, My brother-in-law is the county lieutenant of this county. My brother-in-law is the county lieutenant of this county. He won't let you off for hitting me." "County lieutenant, right?" A cold smile appeared on the face of the leader of the guards and he cracked the knuckles of his fingers. After a few breaths, screams began to echo in the forest. Chapter 135. Those who were dressed in black to act cool in broad daylight were just a bunch of rabble. After being beaten up by old Fong and the others, they obediently squatted in a row, not even daring to breathe loudly. Li Xian opened the curtain and took a look, then lost interest. These small matters could be handled by the guards. When Fong walked in front of those people, the person at the front immediately shivered and said with a trembling voice, "This has nothing to do with us. We were all paid to do this. Someone told us to do this." "Who ordered you to do this?" Fong clenched his fist and looked at him. As soon as his voice fell, the guard leader walked out of the forest with a young man with a swollen face. "It's him." The man in black was frightened by Fong's threatening action. He immediately pointed at the young man and said, "He told us to force the formula of Rui Du." The situation was stronger than the person. If he didn't tell the truth, he was afraid that he would taste the taste of this big man's fist again. He didn't hesitate to give up the mastermind. The young man's whole face was swollen. It took a while for Fong to find a familiar feeling. "So it's you?" It was this guy who brought 2 people to the shop to force them to buy the formula of Rui Du. Fong had a deep impression of him. "Young master, these people are after the formula of Rui Du." The guard leader threw the young man who had already fainted on the ground and stood in front of the carriage and said, "Leave a few people to deal with it. If there's nothing else, go back to the city." A corner of the curtain was lifted and Li Xian's voice came out. There were still a lot of unanswered questions. He didn't want to waste any more time here. Yes. The leader of the guards responded and then whispered a few words to the 3 guards. The carriage then set off, leaving the 3 guards behind to deal with this matter. Fang looked at the carriage with a puzzled expression, then turned his head to look at the guy who had yet to determine a winner. He couldn't help but feel astonished. Son-in-law had never mentioned what these people were doing, and Fang had never taken the initiative to ask either. He only knew that these people wanted to cooperate with them on Ruilu's business. At this moment he finally realized that this gigolo friend of his son-in-law did not seem to be an ordinary person. Go! Watching the carriage leave, the 3 guards drew out their swords and pointed at the ruffians who had already taken off their night clothes. Although there were only the 3 of them, the ruffians did not dare to act rashly or have any thoughts of resisting. After what happened just now, they realized that they had provoked someone they shouldn't have. If they behaved themselves, they might be able to avoid some physical pain. Moreover, although there were only 3 of them, each of them had extraordinary skills. County Magistrate Lu spat out the tea before he swallowed it. The teacup fell from his hand, and the hem of his clothes was completely wet by the tea. He suddenly stood up from the chair and asked loudly, "What did you just say?" The bailiff was also shocked and hurriedly repeated, "People from Prince Ning's mansion came and arrested the county lieutenant. They are waiting for you in the front hall." "Why didn't you say such a big thing earlier?" County Magistrate Lu showed anger on his face. He kicked the bailiff to the ground and hurriedly ran out without even changing his official uniform. He did not dare to let the people from Prince Ning's mansion wait for him. Speaking of which, he was quite aggrieved as a county magistrate. In other counties, the county magistrate was a big shot who could cover the sky with one hand. However, in Anxi County, in Qing'an Prefecture, the number of people who could crush him to death could not be counted with 2 hands. Prince Ning's mansion was the biggest monster that he could not afford to offend. As the blood brother of the current emperor, he was deeply trusted by the emperor and held great power. He had to be careful even if he was just a steward in the mansion. The bailiff struggled to get up from the ground. He touched his chest and said in a low voice with great grievance, "Didn't you ask me to knock before coming in?" County Magistrate Lu hurriedly ran from the back hall to the front hall. As soon as he stepped into the door, he saw more than 10 people squatting on the ground. The one at the innermost with a knife against his neck was County Lieutenant Zhou, who was still in a daze. County Magistrate Lu's heart sank at once when he looked at those men with sabers who wore stern expressions. This time he might really have pierced the sky. Chapter 136. In the front hall, in addition to these people, there were also many yamen runners. At this time, they were holding water and fire rods and looking at the guards of Prince Ning Mansion with vigilance. They looked very nervous. After seeing County Magistrate Lu appear, they let out a long sigh of relief. Just now, these people swaggered into the county government and arrested County Magistrate Zhou without any explanation. At first, they thought that someone was rebelling and wanted to arrest them first. But after hearing that they were from Prince Ning Mansion, they dared not to act rashly. They were just lowly yamen runners. It was better not to provoke this kind of thing. In front of so many people, County Magistrate Lu had to show some dignity. He tidied his clothes and walked in slowly. Glancing at County Magistrate Zhou, he looked as usual and asked those guards, "I'm the county magistrate of this county. May I know who you are?" Before he finished his words, a guard took out a token from his waist. After recognizing the symbol of Prince Ning Mansion on it, County Magistrate Lu no longer had any doubts in his heart. He pointed to County Magistrate Zhou and said, "May I know what crime County Magistrate Zhou has committed to make you mobilize so many people?" In fact, County Magistrate Lu was extremely dissatisfied with these people from Prince Ning Mansion. No matter what, this was the Anxi County government, his territory. These people had captured his subordinates without distinguishing between right and wrong, and they even had a deadpan expression on their faces. Anyone would be displeased if they were in his shoes. However, they were Prince Ning's men after all, so he dared not show his dissatisfaction. "Is it a big crime to cover up and connive at the assassin who assassinated the young prince?" The guard looked at him coldly and asked, "What?" Hearing this, County Magistrate Lu's indifferent face disappeared. He staggered and almost fell to the ground in fear. He turned his head to look at County Magistrate Zhou with a strong disbelief and admiration on his face. He even dared to cover up the assassin who assassinated the young prince. Why didn't he know that County Magistrate Zhou was so bold? Even he, County Magistrate Lu, dared not do this. What County Magistrate Lu didn't know was that County Magistrate Zhou was also shocked at this time. When did he cover up the assassin who assassinated the young prince? He wouldn't dare to do that even if he was 10 times more courageous. Although he didn't know why these people would wrongly accuse him, there was one thing he was very clear about. If he didn't explain himself clearly, he would really die today. Assassinating a relative of the imperial family, the lightest punishment would be exile for 3,000 miles. If it was a little more serious, it was even possible to lose one's head. Even if it was covering up, it was still a very serious crime. Just at this time, the young man lying in the corner finally woke up. As he opened his eyes, he saw his brother-in-law, who was the county magistrate, and finally released the grievances in his heart and shouted, "Brother-in-law, they beat me. Arrest them." It was also at this time that the young man lying in the corner finally woke up. As soon as he opened his eyes, he saw his brother-in-law, who was a county lieutenant. The countless grievances in his heart were finally released. He shouted loudly, "Brother-in-law, they beat me. Quick, send someone to arrest them." Unlike the county magistrate who needed to be appointed by the emperor, the county magistrate had always been appointed by the local government. They were mainly in charge of justice, arresting bandits, collecting taxes and other affairs. Although they didn't have a high position in the eyes of ordinary people, it was already a very high position. The county magistrate was in charge of the administrative affairs of the county, and it was the county magistrate who was in charge of the specific execution. Judging cases and collecting taxes were all the duties of the county magistrate, which were closely related to the people. To a certain extent, having a county magistrate as his brother-in-law was enough for him to do whatever he wanted in Anshi County. Although there were many people here that he couldn't afford to offend, it definitely didn't include these guys who came from the mountains. "Brother-in-law, they beat me. Arrest them." When the young man shouted, County Magistrate Joe couldn't say a word anymore, as if he was choked by someone. Just now, with a knife against his neck, he was so frightened that he didn't see the unconscious young man at all. County Magistrate Joe opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face was pale. He never expected this. County Magistrate Liu also looked at the young man in astonishment. The one who assassinated the young prince was actually County Magistrate Joe's brother-in-law? In that case, there was nothing more to say. Although he didn't believe that guy actually had the guts to rush to assassinate the young prince, no matter whether there was any misunderstanding or not, County Magistrate Joe couldn't escape this time. It was probably because of his brother-in-law, who was a county magistrate, that the young man could rely on him and run amok everywhere. This time he finally kicked a hard iron plate. It seemed that County Magistrate Joe didn't know anything about this matter, but since such a thing had happened, his position as county magistrate would definitely be gone. As for what kind of punishment he would have after his dismissal, it could only depend on Prince Ning's mansion's attitude. "No, after I go back, I have to restrain that unfilial son of mine. If he continued to act like he did before, I'm afraid that tomorrow's County Magistrate Liu would be today's County Magistrate Joe." At this time, it was not County Magistrate Joe who hated the young man the most, but those ruffians who were hired by him. More than a dozen pairs of fiery eyes stared at him as if they wanted to skin him alive. They thought it was just an ordinary fight, but who would have thought that the other party was actually a young prince? Just for a tale of silver, they even sacrificed their lives. At this time, the young man had already sensed that something was wrong. He stared blankly at County Magistrate Joe, who still had a knife on his neck, and stopped shouting. His heart gradually sank. These people's target was obviously not Li Xian, but since it involved the young prince, they naturally couldn't let them go so easily. Beheading and exiling them was a bit too severe, and it also needed to be approved by the emperor. Although these people were wrong, they didn't deserve death. However, forcibly snatching the formula of Ruidu also targeted Prince Ning's mansion. Even if they didn't die, they would still lose a layer of skin. Seeing that the people of Prince Ning's mansion didn't seem to want to make the matter bigger, County Magistrate Liu let out a long sigh in his heart. However, he didn't expect that the popular Ruidu and Qing and mansion was actually Prince Ning's mansion's business, which really surprised him. It must be said that County Magistrate Joe was really unlucky to meet such an outrageous relative who even dared to snatch the Prince Ning's mansion's business. No matter what, the county magistrate was one of the big shots in the county government. What happened in the county government today quickly spread out. Did you hear? Something happened in the county government today. No way, what could happen in the county government? I also heard from the brothers who work in the county government. This time, County Magistrate Joe is probably in big trouble. I heard that it was County Magistrate Joe's brother-in-law who asked someone to force the formula of Ruidu. I didn't expect that Ruidu was also related to Prince Ning's mansion. Ruidu? You mean the Rui Do sold in Rui Workshop in the city? Other than Rui Workshop, which other shop in the city sells Rui Do? What Rui Do is related to Prince Ning's mansion? In a courtyard with high walls, there came the sound of a teacup shattering. How could it be? Hearing this news, a famous rich merchant in Qing and mansion was dumbfounded. Fortunately, we haven't done anything otherwise. In other places there were also people who were shocked and broke out in a cold sweat. Chapter 137. Li Yi only found out about this after Fang and the others returned from the prefectural city. Li Yi could only mourn for the fool who wanted to block Li Xian's carriage. He had originally thought that when the shop operated by Ning Wangfu opened, those who were eyeing Rui's Lu would naturally give up on their evil thoughts. After being stirred up by that foppish son, everyone had probably gotten wind of it and no longer dared to have any thoughts about Rui's Lu. After calming down and thinking carefully, the conclusion Li Yi arrived at made him sigh endlessly. If he didn't know Li Xian and didn't cooperate with Ning Wangfu on Rui's Lu, even a small county officer would have brought him a lot of trouble. After all, one was a commoner and the other was an official. The people who came to frame them and the constables who colluded with them were most likely instructed by the county officer. In this day and age it was better to be an official. If he was a county officer, wouldn't there be none of these things? Of course, if he really wanted to be a county officer, Li Yi was also unwilling. It wasn't worth it to do so many things with such a small salary. Wouldn't it be better to hold on to the thigh of Ning Wangfu? Wouldn't it be better than being some county magistrate? Of course, distant water couldn't quench immediate thirst. Not every time something happened, Li Xian would appear at the right time. If he could hold on to one more thigh, he would have one more choice when the time came. Therefore, when the patrolling female arrestor passed by the entrance of the shop, Li Yi greeted her politely. "Arrestor Li, you're patrolling the streets again. Do you want to come in and have a cup of water? Do you have wine?" The girl in light blue looked at him and raised her eyebrows as she asked. "Yes." Li Yi replied with a smile. The wine was a strong liquor made using the distillation method. Before the wine shop that cooperated with Ning Wangfu opened, it was the only one in Qing and prefectural city. If there was wine, there would naturally be dishes. Things were different now compared to when he first came here. With money, he didn't have to live a life without much money. 2 cold dishes and 2 hot dishes were made by Li Yi himself. They were perfect to go with wine. "Constable Li, please." Emingzu Li looked at the dishes on the table as a look of astonishment flashed across her face. "Didn't you say that you only came in for a glass of water?" No matter how he looked at it, the scene in front of him seemed to have been prepared. He glanced at Li Yi and sat down. Regardless of what he was thinking, at least the dishes and wine looked good. It could be seen that he had put some effort into it. He picked up his chopsticks and took a bite of the side dish that smelled pretty good. He was very satisfied with this unique taste. "What's the matter? Say it." He took another sip of wine and looked at Li Yi indifferently. She actually admired this scholar's ability. For the sake of this table of dishes and wine, if his request was not too excessive, she would consider it. "Constable Li, you misunderstood. If it wasn't for you, I'm afraid that the lawsuit at Rui Restaurant would have been unavoidable. This is just a small dish and wine to express my gratitude." Li Yi smiled and looked at her calmly. He really didn't have anything to ask of this female constable at the moment. Even if he did, he couldn't say it out loud. As the saying goes, if you take something from someone, you'll have to bear the consequences. The Anxi County government was not far from the shop. If this princess dined and drank here for a few times, how could she stand by and watch when something really happened in the future? He was only building a good relationship now. Of course, he couldn't casually ask for anything. "It's my duty. No need to thank me." Emingzu Li glanced at him and continued to eat and drink. Needless to say, these dishes and wine were very much to her taste. "I heard that you've cooperated with Prince Ning Mansion in the business of Rui Nectar?" Li Yi nodded. The news had spread pretty fast. Today was only the 2nd day. "You're smart." The wine that old Fang had secretly hidden was almost finished by her, but her expression did not change. She looked at Li Yi with a rare hint of approval in her eyes. It was undeniable that Rui Nectar was a good thing. It contained a huge profit. Few people could resist the temptation. If one didn't have enough power, he couldn't protect such a treasure. It wouldn't be long before he was devoured by those people. The smartest way was to climb up a higher tree and give up a part of the profit to protect himself. But she didn't expect him to have the ability to climb up to Prince Ning Mansion. It seemed that his relationship with her cousin was not ordinary. When Emingzu Li thought of this, someone walked in from the door. The next moment, Li Xian looked at her in surprise and asked, "Emingzu, why are you here?" After saying this, he suddenly sniffed and asked, "What's so fragrant?" Following the fragrance, he looked at the wine and dishes on the table. After a while, there was another pair of chopsticks on the table. Li Xian looked at his cousin who was drinking by herself on the side with some confusion. He was a little confused about why she would appear here, but his attention was soon attracted by the wine and dishes in front of him. He poured a cup of wine and just picked it up, thinking that he came here for official business today. He hesitated and put it down. He looked at Li Yi and asked, "You said that the ground under our feet is round. Do you have any proof?" "No." Li Yi took a sip of tea and said straightforwardly. With Li Xian's curious baby personality, if he explained, the other would definitely ask questions endlessly. It was better not to give him any chance. "Then what you said last time, why do leaves fall to the ground, why do mirrors appear in the water, and—" Li Xian didn't dwell on the question just now. Anyway, he still had a lot of questions and there would be opportunities to ask. The expression on Li Yi's face froze. Then he looked at him and said seriously, "Let's talk about the problem of the ground being round." Li Xian looked up at him, waiting for him to explain. Actually, to be accurate, it should be a ball and not so round. This problem was actually not difficult to explain. The curved sea surface, the ships that came from the sea would always see the mast first, and when they looked up at the sky, the two sides were low and the middle was high. These common phenomena in daily life could all be explained. Even using an analogy, it could be easily explained. The moon and the sun were both round, but the ground under their feet was square. Wasn't it a little weird and unsociable? However, Li Xian had never seen the sea before. He ran to the courtyard to look at the sky, but he couldn't see the difference between the height of the sky and the height of the moon, nor could he understand the relationship between the moon and the ground under their feet. Li Yi began to feel a headache. "I'm going to patrol the streets." Emmingsu finally understood why the two of them had such a close relationship. It was very normal for two people who were suffering from hysteria to feel like they understood each other. He knew that he couldn't provoke his father right now, so he stuttered, "Recite it for me." He didn't know what was wrong with his father today. Why did he suddenly want to test him on his homework? The devilish brat rejoiced in his heart. Fortunately, he had memorized those convoluted words yesterday. He immediately recited them. Although he stumbled, he didn't make any mistakes. After listening to the naughty child recite it, Housekeeper Wang's expression finally became a little better. However, he had some doubts in his heart. In the past, when he was tested on his homework, this brat had never been able to completely recite it. What was going on this time? Was he bewitched? He originally thought that if he couldn't recite it, he would reprimand him, warning him to study hard and not to only think about playing and eating all day. He didn't expect the naughty brat to perform so well. The reprimand that he had prepared immediately became useless. His good plan was interrupted, and Housekeeper Wang's face became serious again. He casually pulled over a piece of white paper, picked up a pen and wrote a few lines on it. He handed it to the naughty brat and said, "There is no end to learning. Don't be arrogant and complacent. Go and memorize these lines. I'll check them at night." A few days ago, when they were on the mountain, the female teacher made the group of children recite these lines. Housekeeper Wang's ears almost grew calluses from listening to them that day, so he inadvertently memorized those lines. At this time he could use these lines to send the naughty brat away. At least before he could memorize them, he wouldn't bother him. "Go, go." Housekeeper Wang waved his hand and said impatiently. The naughty brat took the paper and walked out of the room in a daze. His 10-year-old brain still couldn't completely understand why he didn't receive a reward when he had clearly memorized them, but a punishment for continuing to memorize. The naughty brat, who had been tricked by his father, sat under the eaves of the side room with a lifeless expression. He raised his head and looked at the sky, revealing an expression of despair. After a long time, the naughty brat let out a long sigh and raised the paper in his hand. Having attended a private school for a few years, he could already recognize quite a few words. Soon a voice sounded from under the eaves. "The rules of a disciple, the teachings of a saint, are first filial piety, then trustworthiness. Love the masses, be close to the people, and if you have the strength to spare, learn literature." Sigh. The voice was clear and lively like a child's, yet it was mixed with sighs. It was a bit out of place with the atmosphere at this time. At the same time, a middle-aged man with a dignified expression walked out of Prince Ning's study. He rubbed the space between his brows. The cold autumn wind blew past, and it actually made him much more clear-headed. "Sir Prefect, shall I escort you back?" An old man wearing the robes of a housekeeper walked over and said respectfully. The middle-aged man waved his hand and said, "There's no need. I know the roads and the manner." You can walk back yourself. Hearing this, the old man didn't insist. He watched the middle-aged man's figure disappear before turning to leave. At this time, the middle-aged man walking in the manor had a worried expression on his face. As the prefect of Qing and Fu, he was in charge of all matters in the manor. In another 2 months he would return to the capital to report on his duties. At that time, the court would conduct an examination of his achievements, including this year's situation with regards to Qing and Fu's population, land clearing, tax collection, food, public security, education, and other aspects. He would be promoted, punished, and rewarded accordingly. He wasn't worried about farming and collecting taxes, but he was worried about the education of the people. The students of Qing and Fu had not performed well in this year's examinations. The number of imperial examinations they had received was far less than in previous years. This way, his achievements in education would be greatly reduced. But the work of education could not be accomplished in a day. Although improvements in other areas could completely cover up the lack of education, it was still somewhat embarrassing. After all, Qing and Fu was the largest city in the Jing kingdom other than the capital. The number of students was also second only to the capital. In previous years, the number of students who passed the examinations was enough to compete with the capital, but this time they were left far behind. As he was thinking about this matter, he suddenly heard a child's voice when he passed by a certain room. The rules of the disciples, the teachings of the saints, the first is filial piety, the second is honesty. Sai, love the masses, be close to the people and have the strength to spare, learn literature. Tang Shueqiao, Sai. Chapter 139. The rules of a disciple, the teachings of a saint, the first is filial piety, the second is trust. Tang Shueqiao? The middle-aged man stopped walking and carefully listened to the contents of the child's recitation. A trace of doubt appeared on his face. These 3 sentences were easy to recite, and although the words were easy to understand if one listened carefully, it seemed to have the effect of enlightenment. It was very suitable for teaching children. There were similar teachings in the Mongolian language, but they were relatively obscure. It was rare to see such a simple and easy to understand one. Furthermore, he had never heard of the text that the child was reciting. Also, what was that Tang Shueqiao? After standing outside the courtyard and listening for a while, the child repeated the same few sentences. The middle-aged man had already thought of a few things. A trace of eagerness appeared on his face as he walked in with large strides. The devilish child held the paper in his hands and carried it back and forth. The only words he repeated were, Tang Shueqiao. He was drooling when he heard footsteps. When he raised his head, he saw a stranger walk into the courtyard. The devilish child looked at him in a daze and a trace of caution appeared on his face. Little child, what text did you recite just now? Magistrate Dong walked in front of the devilish child and asked in a pleasant manner. His father had said that the people living in the Wangfu were all nobles. He was to only play in this area and not to bump into others. He stared blankly at the stranger in front of him and didn't reply. He obediently handed over the paper in his hands. Magistrate Dong took the piece of paper from the naughty child's hands and discovered that there were only a few sentences written on it. After he finished reading the contents of the few lines, his eyes brightened and he asked somewhat urgently, "Do you know who wrote this?" Housekeeper Wang was still in the room checking the accounts when the door was pushed open again. He raised his head and saw the devilish child's head poking in again. When he lowered his head again, he suddenly forgot where he had been calculating. A trace of anger appeared on his face as he glared at the devilish child and said, "Did you memorize it all? If you didn't, be careful of your butt." At this time, a hand reached out from behind the devilish child and completely pushed open the door. A familiar-looking middle-aged man walked in from outside. Seeing that person, Housekeeper Wang was first stunned, then he suddenly stood up from his seat, his face pale, and said with a trembling voice, "Magistrate Dong." At this moment he felt a lingering fear. Could it be that this little brat had offended Magistrate Dong, and he was here to punish him? Thinking of this, Shopkeeper Wang's legs suddenly felt weak, and he almost collapsed on the chair again. "Let me ask you, this 3-word rhyme was written by you. Is there anything else?" Magistrate Dong didn't have time to waste with him. He took the paper and walked in front of him. 3 words of rhyme? Housekeeper Wang stared blankly at the paper in Magistrate Dong's hand that he had just written to the naughty child. He then looked at Magistrate Dong's expression, and his heart slightly relaxed. As long as he wasn't here to denounce him, thinking of this, he immediately changed his expression and explained with an apologetic smile. "I didn't expect such a capable person to exist in such a small mountain village. After listening, Magistrate Dong stroked the short beard on his chin and praised. With his knowledge, he could naturally see the meaning behind these few short sentences. This was clearly a Mongolian text to teach children to learn etiquette. Without etiquette, one would not be able to stand. From a young age, teaching them to develop a kind and honest nature, teaching them to be virtuous, to guard against evil, and to be sincere was also beneficial in developing good family and academic values. If this text could be carried out, it would definitely be a great contribution to education. It would be a good deed that would last for thousands of years. Not only would the difficult problem he was facing be easily solved, if he really made some achievements, there might even be a slight possibility of leaving his name in history, as an official who didn't want to leave a thick stroke in the history books. Just based on other political achievements, to achieve this was tantamount to reaching the heavens. But the merit of education could influence future generations. Thinking of this, even with his temperament, he couldn't help but feel a surge of emotions. Do you know the entire text? Magistrate Dong looked at Housekeeper Wang with sparkling eyes and asked. At this moment, he desperately wanted to know if this text was as he imagined it to be, an excellent piece of teaching Mongolian so that he wouldn't rejoice for nothing. Sir, I only heard about a dozen sentences that day. I don't know if there is the entire text, Housekeeper Wang replied honestly. Magistrate Dong looked at him and thought for a moment before saying, send someone to ask the village teacher again. If there really is it, you must bring the entire text back and send it to the yamen. The housekeeper of the Wang Fu could be considered a top figure outside, but in front of Qing and Magistrate, he could only nod and say yes. In order to show the importance he placed on this matter, the moment Magistrate Dong's foot left, Housekeeper Wang hurriedly left the Wang Fu. He ordered the servant to drive the carriage faster and try to finish this matter in the shortest amount of time possible. Outside the school in Willow Leaf Village, Qing once again saw Housekeeper Wang. When she found out that he had not come to find her brother-in-law, but to find her, she was slightly surprised. She had some impression of Housekeeper Wang. She only knew that he seemed to be her brother-in-law's friend. A few days ago she had seen the two of them talking by the stream. She did not slight him, but after hearing the purpose of his visit, she was slightly surprised. What you were talking about just now, was it this rules for a disciple ? Qing returned to the school and took out a thin book that she had personally written. She handed it to Housekeeper Wang. Housekeeper Wang quickly took it. After flipping it open, he saw that the first few sentences were exactly the same as what he had heard that day. He flipped a few more pages and saw that there were hundreds of sentences behind. Only then did he realize that what he had heard that day was just a few paragraphs. He was overjoyed. Now he could finally report to Magistrate Dong. I wonder if you could give me a copy of the original rules for a disciple ? He looked at Qing and asked urgently. Hearing this, Qing hesitated slightly and said, this rules for a disciple was not written by me. I will have to ask before I can give you an answer. It was not written by you? Housekeeper Wang's expression froze. Qing nodded and gave him a brief explanation. It's actually him. Housekeeper Wang murmured a few words. He didn't expect that this article was written by that mean scholar. He was slightly surprised for a while, then smiled and said, to tell you the truth, I was ordered by Prefectural Magistrate Dong to retrieve the original text of rules for disciples. Prefectural Magistrate Dong was very pleased with this article. This is a great thing for young Master Li. Magistrate Dong. Hearing this, Qing covered her small mouth in surprise and couldn't help but exclaim. For someone like her who had lived here since she was young and rarely left the village, the Anshi County Magistrate was already a high position. Any higher would be an unimaginable level for her. Chapter 140. Good, what a good disciple rules! Prefectural Magistrate Dong flipped through the thin book in his hands and the worry on his face disappeared. After reading the entire disciple rules, he couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. Disciple rules? A person standing quietly in the hall raised his head and looked at Prefectural Magistrate Dong with a confused expression. He didn't know what made Magistrate Dong so happy, and what was this disciple rules? Professor Feng, take a look at this disciple rules as well. Seeing the confusion of the person in the hall, Prefectural Magistrate Dong closed the book and handed it over. The man called Professor Feng accepted the book with both hands, his heart full of suspicion. When he looked at it, he saw the beautiful 3 small words on the cover, Disciple Rules. He raised his head and glanced at Prefectural Magistrate Dong before flipping to the first page. There were only a few thousand words, but Professor Feng read very slowly. Gradually, his expression changed from calm to excited. Magistrate Dong, this disciple rules? Who wrote it? Professor Feng raised his head to look at Prefectural Magistrate Dong, his expression shocked. These 3 words are simple and easy to understand. They promote filial piety, honesty, benevolence, and observance of propriety. It is truly an excellent work for enlightening and educating the disciples. As a prefectural school professor and the head of the prefectural scholars, his responsibility was to educate and instruct. Speaking of which, he understood the meaning of this disciple rules, even more than Prefectural Magistrate Dong. Congratulations, Magistrate. With this disciple rules, you no longer need to worry about educating. Professor Feng quickly understood the crux of the matter and saluted Prefectural Magistrate Dong with his fists. Of course, he understood the difficulties Prefectural Magistrate Dong faced. If he presented this disciple rules, he could make up for the lack of educating this year. I heard that this article was written by a scholar in the prefecture. I owe it all to him. Prefectural Magistrate Dong was clearly in a good mood and no longer had the troubled expression from before. When the steward of the mansion had delivered the article, he had already told him that this disciple rules was not written by the female teacher. It was written by a young man named Li Yi. Prefectural Magistrate Dong immediately sent someone to investigate the scholar's background. Of course, the most important thing was to confirm whether or not he was from Qing'an. If the rules for disciples had already appeared elsewhere, then wouldn't he have been happy for nothing? Fortunately, Li Yi did not disappoint him. He had the title of xianxia and was a member of Qing'an prefecture under his rule. Prefectural Magistrate Dong had already memorized this name. If he were to become a high scholar in the future, he could take care of him and recommend him to the Ministry of Appointments so that he could fill the vacancy. It's all thanks to Sir's guidance. Professor Feng flattered him at the right time. If this rules for disciples could be implemented, then the credit of educating would definitely fall onto Magistrate Dong's head. Magistrate Dong seemed to have thought of something. He shook his head and said, "It's just that the elementary scholar named Li Yi doesn't seem to want to improve himself. He doesn't focus on his studies and wants to become a high scholar as soon as possible. Instead, he opens a shop in the city. A good scholar doesn't want to be a businessman. If I hadn't sent someone to verify this, I wouldn't have believed that he was the one who wrote the rules for disciples." Li? Professor Feng paused and asked, "Is it the Li Yi who wrote Immortal Magpie Bridge and Shuidiao? Professor Feng also knows this person?" Prefectural Magistrate Dong raised his eyebrows and asked. "The Li Yi I know is the one who wrote Immortal Magpie Bridge and Shuidiao. Li Yi is unparalleled in poetry and was called the #1 scholar of the Jing Kingdom by the Secretary of Education. I don't know if it's the same person that Sir is talking about," Professor Feng said after some thought. "Shuidiao? The poem that was circulated during the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet?" Prefectural Magistrate Dong furrowed his eyebrows. In his opinion, poetry was just a small path and had no use in governing a country. It was all leftovers from their playtime. As for the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, he only went through the motions and didn't pay much attention to it. Later he only heard about Shuidiao from the daughter of the manor. As for who wrote the poem, he wasn't too sure. If it is really as Sir says, then this kind of scholar who doesn't know how to improve should be given a beating. If we can get him to return to the right path, perhaps he will be another good talent in the future. Professor Feng heard this and said with a frown. As a prefectural professor, what he did the most was to teach and guide the students of the prefectural school. Who knew how many stubborn and mischievous students had walked the right path under his guidance? I didn't think that the teacher would have such an evaluation of him. I am even more curious about this person. A look of interest appeared on Prefectural Magistrate Dong's face as he stroked the short beard on his chin. These few days the young masters and misses of Qing'an prefectural city had many complaints about the Rui workshop. Since a few days ago this shop had stopped selling Ruidu. They could only rely on previous orders to get the goods. This caused many people who didn't have the time to buy to feel regret. In the present Qing'an prefectural city, Ruidu had clearly become the leading fashion trend. Chapter 141. Have you heard? Other than the Rui workshop, a few more shops in the city have started selling Ruidu. How come I didn't know? Is the news true? It's true. Today a few more shops in the city have Ruidu on sale. Before I came I saw someone buy it. Let's hurry to that shop. If we're late we'll have to wait a few more days. Seeing a few scholarly-looking youths pass by them and rush in a certain direction, a middle-aged man wearing an ordinary Confucian robe said with some confusion, "These days there's an item called Ruidu. It's all the rage in the prefectural city, especially among the socialites. Why are these men rushing like ducks for it? Another person beside him said, Magistrate, you may not know this, but this rui nectar is highly regarded among the students. By smearing it on one's body, it can relieve fatigue, refresh one's mind, and increase one's spirit by 100 times. When a student is tired from studying, just a few drops would be enough for them to continue studying. These two people dressed in plain clothes walking slowly on the street were Magistrate Dong and Professor Feng. Because of the rules for disciples, they were very curious about the elementary scholar named Li Yi. They wanted to see for themselves what kind of person was able to write such a piece of Mongolian literature, and what kind of person he was. Of course, other than this reason, they also wanted to use this opportunity to teach him to turn over a new leaf and diligently seek scholarly honors. If he really did succeed in the future, the magistrate and the professor would personally come to reprimand him, causing him to suddenly come to his senses and devote himself to studying. This would become a legend. If that's the case, then he has benefited the students of Qingyan Prefecture, Magistrate Dong said with some surprise. He was not unfamiliar with this ruidu. These days the women in the family often used this item. The mistress had even mentioned to him that this item was being fought over by many socialites. If she hadn't sent a servant girl to buy dozens of bottles, she probably wouldn't have been able to buy it. However, this was the first time he knew that this ruidu had such an effect. If he could help these students and make them study more diligently, it would be a great contribution. Professor Feng nodded and said, Yes, in the prefectural school, there are already many students who have responded that this item is indeed very useful for studying. I am thinking of purchasing a batch to see if it can be popularized. Yesterday, after Prefectural Magistrate Dong had asked to see the scholar named Li Yi, he had done some research. Only then did he discover that the author of Rules for Disciples was the person the Minister of Education called the #1 scholar in the Jing Kingdom. At the same time, he was also the shopkeeper of the Rui workshop in Qingyan Prefecture. Looking into the hall, the first person he saw was not the scholar, but a beautiful woman wearing a light blue constable's uniform. When Magistrate Dong entered, the woman happened to raise her head to look at him. The moment he saw the woman, Magistrate Dong stopped in his tracks. His body trembled and the dignified expression on his face disappeared. His expression became serious, and he was about to speak when the woman waved her hand casually. Magistrate Dong's words were immediately stuck in his throat. Professor Feng did not recognize the woman. After entering, he wore the serious expression that he usually wore in front of students. He walked to the side of the only young man in the hall and asked, You are Li Yi? Li Yi's face showed a look of shock. No way, someone really came to cause trouble? This person showed a grim face the moment he entered and named him by name. One look and he knew that this person did not come with good intentions. He turned his head to look at Mingzu and blinked. As a constable, this person came to bully you right in front of your face and you don't care? Mingzu took a sip of wine, the expression on her pretty face did not change. Seeing that Li Yi did not answer, Professor Feng thought that he had frightened him and continued to ask, That disciple rules, was it your creation? Disciple rules? Li Yi finally understood that the other person was not here to cause trouble. Yesterday, Qing had told him that the magistrate had sent someone to take away the disciple rules that he had modified. At that time, Li Yi had been a little surprised. The only people who knew about the disciple rules were him, Qing, and those naughty children. How did the magistrate know about it? But now was not the time to think about this. The magistrate was a very high position. The magistrate of Qingyan Prefecture was almost equivalent to the mayor of a municipality in the future. The rank was very high and Li Yi did not dare to slight him. He immediately stood up. Welcome, Lord Prefectural Magistrate. Please take a seat, please take a seat. He did not know how to greet such a high official, so he hurriedly said this based on the little impression he had seen in the television series. Li Yi's action shocked Professor Feng. The serious expression on his face immediately disappeared. The magistrate was right beside him. Even if he had a few more guts, he would not dare to sit. Chapter 142. Professor Feng was choked by Li Yi's words. He coughed dryly and said awkwardly, Ahem, don't talk nonsense. I am the prefectural school professor of Qingyan Prefecture. Call me a beast? Li Yi looked at the middle-aged man in front of him with some surprise. His first thought was that he was actually a university professor in the future. He then realized that professor seemed to be an official position here, mainly responsible for the education of a prefecture. The prefectural school professor of Qingyan Prefecture was almost equivalent to the director of the city's education bureau in the future. However, he didn't plan on taking the imperial examinations. Even if he was the director of the education bureau, he wouldn't be able to control him, much less the director of the education bureau. Since he wasn't the prefectural magistrate, Li Yi didn't need to be so careful. However, he still had the necessary etiquette. After all, he still had the identity of a scholar. He bowed respectfully and said, "Sir, the rules of a disciple was written by me." Shamelessly claiming the fruits of someone else's labor as his own, he blushed slightly. Professor Feng nodded slightly. The young man in front of him looked talented. Looking at his words and actions, he seemed to be a person who knew how to behave. His first impression of him was not bad. However, thinking about it, to be able to write an essay like, "The Rules of a Disciple," his character would certainly not be bad. If he could be guided a little and get him on the right path, he might be able to achieve great things in the future. In layman's terms, he felt that Li Yi still needed to be saved. He nodded in satisfaction and then turned to look at Prefectural Magistrate Dong. After all, Prefectural Magistrate Dong was the main character today. There were some things that he shouldn't meddle in. Prefectural Magistrate Dong didn't seem to see his gaze. He looked around at the decorations in the shop. One moment he looked at the shelves, the next moment he looked at the paintings on the wall. He didn't seem to speak at all. Seeing this, Professor Feng was slightly taken aback. He wondered what was wrong with Prefectural Magistrate Dong. Didn't he say he would personally lecture him? Before he came, Prefectural Magistrate Dong had specifically told him not to reveal his identity and to just treat him as one of his tutors. However, Professor Feng didn't dare to treat him as a tutor. Seeing this, he didn't dare to remind him and could only do it himself. What Professor Feng didn't know was that Prefectural Magistrate Dong was still curious as to why Princess Yongle was here. What was her relationship with this scholar? Why would she speak so casually? Professor Feng looked at Li Yi and said in a deep voice, "The rhythm of this disciple rules is easy to read and the content is simple. It preaches the way of the sage. I have discussed with the Prefectural Magistrate, and we wish to use it as an introductory book to spread throughout the prefecture. Are you willing?" Li Yi was not surprised by Professor Feng's words. Yesterday, when Qin Qing told him about this matter, Li Yi had already prepared himself for someone to come looking for him. After such a long time, he had more or less figured out the situation of this world. When he first read the annals of the Jing Kingdom, he was completely clueless about the history of the Jing Kingdom. However, when he went back further, he could find some familiar traces. Xia, Shang, Zhou, Qin, Chu, Han, three kingdoms, Wei, Jin, and northern and southern dynasties were all there. The general direction remained the same, but when Li Yi compared more specific details, characters, or some minor events with the history books in the library, he found that there were still some discrepancies. The wheel of history officially began to deviate and diverge, probably during the Sui and Tang dynasties. The country named Tang ended the chaotic times at the end of the Sui dynasty. However, not long after the country was founded, it welcomed a major split, forming a regime similar to the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. The Jing Kingdom was established at that time, and it had been 50 to 60 years since then. There was no 3-character classic or 1,000-character classic in this world. Although there were other introductory books to replace them, they were relatively obscure and not suitable for children to learn. They were far from being as easy to understand as the disciple rules. The disciple rules still had a lot of controversy in later generations. Some people said that it promoted foolish teachings, and was only suitable for the ancient feudal society. Both sides expressed their own views and the controversy was not small. However, in the current Jing Kingdom, where Confucianism was still the mainstream, no one dared to say that the disciple rules promoted foolish teachings. The father was the ruler of the sons, and the monarch was the ruler of the ministers. Daring to say that this was a feudal way of thinking, did you want a rebel? With such a big label on your head, even the most powerful person would be crushed to death. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Li looked at Professor Feng, cupped his fists and said, "Everything is up to you, Your Excellency." This professor had already discussed with the prefectural magistrate, and he still came to ask for his opinion. Wasn't this too much? If he really felt that it was not good to take something from someone else for free, he could just give him a few thousand taels of silver. You are worth teaching. Professor Feng was even more satisfied. He thought to himself that this elementary scholar was not like what he had thought. He looked like a promising talent. As Emingzi listened to the conversation between the two of them, she could not help but feel a trace of happiness in her heart. What was this disciple's rules? It actually made Prefectural Magistrate Dong and the Prefectural School Professor come to visit at the same time. Could it be that this scholar had some abilities that she did not know of? As she thought of this, when she looked at Li Yi again, a strange look appeared in her eyes. As for Prefectural Magistrate Dong, he had already completely become a qualified follower. He stood behind Professor Feng without saying a word. Most of his attention was on Mingzu. Since you have such talent, why don't you think of improving yourself and take the imperial examinations to serve the country? As a scholar, you actually chose to walk such a lowly path. Have all these years of reading by the sages been in vain? After asking Li Yi symbolically and going through the process once, the next thing to do was to get to the main point. Professor Feng's face was stern as he looked at him and said this sternly. His voice also raised a few pitches. This was also the way he usually reprimanded his students. Li Yi was shocked. He did not expect this guy to change his attitude so quickly. Just a moment ago he was talking to him in a friendly manner, and the next moment he turned into a coffin face. Li Yi did not react for a moment and stood there in a daze. His expression fell into Professor Feng's eyes. Naturally, he was ashamed of his words and was on the verge of repentance. Professor Feng's expression softened as he looked at him and said, "Since you have done a good job in educating the prefectural school, I can make an exception and allow you to become a scholar in the county school. It will not affect your studies and will also be of great help to you in the future when you take the imperial examinations. First knock him unconscious with a stick, then feed him a sweet date." Professor Feng had been in charge of the prefectural school for so many years and had long since perfected this method. He raised his head slightly and looked at the scholar in front of him, waiting for the moment when he would be deeply grateful to him. Although the rank of a county school official was not high, it was still an official. A high scholar might not care about it, but it was a position that many elementary scholars would fight to get. If he was lucky enough to become a high scholar in the future, he might be directly promoted to a teacher and would not have to wait for the Ministry of Appointments to appoint him. Scholar? After Li Yi reacted, his expression immediately changed. Not long ago he had rejected the position of the school teacher and now someone wanted him to become a scholar. He was completely uninterested in this. If he really became a scholar, he would be under the control of others. He would no longer be able to lie comfortably in the courtyard and bask in the sun. He would also not be able to do things as he pleased. He would probably only be able to earn a few taels of silver a month. He might as well sell a bottle of rui. In just a moment, Li Yi rejected this suggestion. "Why, you are not willing?" Professor Feng looked at him and asked with a frown. "It's not that I am not willing." Li Yi straightened his body and bowed to Professor Feng. With a troubled expression, he said, "It's just that I have had a chronic illness since I was young. Every time I think about taking the imperial examinations and becoming an official, I would be bedridden. I had no choice but to give up on the imperial examinations and become a businessman. Your Excellency, I am very grateful for your kindness. However, because I was born with a chronic illness, I can only thank you for your kindness." Professor Feng was stunned. What kind of chronic illness was this? In this world, was there an illness that prevented one from becoming an official? Chapter 143. Naturally, Professor Feng did not know what terminal laziness cancer meant. None of the students he taught had ever talked nonsense to him with such a straight face. He was still suspicious. Could this really be a strange illness that he had never heard of before? An illness that prevents one from becoming an official? Mingzu had a strange look in her eyes. As for Magistrate Dong, who had been standing silently at the side, his face began to darken. This scholar clearly had no interest in fame and did not want to become a mere academic official. He made up this chronic illness that prevents one from becoming an official to fool Professor Feng, and Professor Feng actually believed it. If Princess Yongla was not present at this moment, Magistrate Dong would have reprimanded this unambitious and self-deprecating student. If everyone was as lazy as him, how could the country recruit talents? Forget it, forget it. Since you have an illness, then rest well. We'll talk about this later. Professor Feng shook his head and sighed. In the prefectural school, there were many students who participated in the imperial examinations. After failing many times, they became absent-minded and eventually went crazy. There were also people who suffered from the shock of failing for a long time and fell ill. Whenever they picked up a book, they would have a splitting headache. Professor Feng had been an official for many years and had seen many such cases. He subconsciously categorized Li Yi as such a person. Fame was important, but it was not worth it to lose one's life for it. Hearing Professor Feng's words, Li Yi was slightly stunned. Did this lord really believe it? At this moment he couldn't help but feel a little guilty in his heart. Deceiving such an honest person really made him feel a little uneasy. I did not expect such a strange illness to exist in this world. This official is truly ignorant. After walking out of Fortune Square, Professor Feng let out a long sigh. There was a deep sense of regret in his tone. Do you really think that he was speaking the truth? Magistrate Dong looked at him with a strange expression. Magistrate Dong had to admit that aside from Princess Yongle, after this incident, his impression of that scholar had become even deeper. Magistrate Dong, what do you mean? Professor Feng looked at him with a face full of confusion. A moment later, a man on the street suddenly flew into a rage and attracted the attention of many people. This brat, how dare he deceive me? Professor Feng was seething with anger. He had been in charge of the school for so many years, and when the students saw him, they were all respectful and courteous. When had he ever met such a stubborn person? At this moment, Professor Feng's heart was filled with doubt. Was the rules for disciples really written by him? As a dignified professor of the Imperial College, he had actually been fooled by an elementary scholar. This was a great humiliation to him. Professor Feng's face was filled with anger. He rolled up his sleeves and was about to leave when he said angrily, "Humph, I have seen many people like him. Even if he is a rotten piece of wood, I will make him repent." Over the years he had taught countless students, but he had also encountered quite a few stubborn people. Professor Feng had developed an obsession with Li Yi. Magistrate Dong shook his head and pulled him back in time. Forget it, forget it. I'm afraid he doesn't care about fame at all. No matter what we say, it's just playing the lute to a cow. Since Professor Feng did not want to be a scholar, they could not force him. Furthermore, there was the princess in the shop, so they could not let Professor Feng meddle. Professor Feng did not know her identity. If he said something wrong and offended the princess, it would not be good. Just as Professor Feng's heart was filled with anger, but he could not go against Magistrate Dong's wishes. Inside the shop, Li Yi was sitting lazily on a chair with his legs crossed. He sipped on his tea and looked extremely relaxed. Why do you not want to be a scholar? Emingzu hugged her saber in front of her chest and looked at him with interest. Ever since the imperial examination system was established, countless students studied hard. Wasn't it so that one day they could pass the imperial examinations and fight for a position in the government? It was rare to see a scholar who did not want to be an official. Li Yi pursed his lips and swallowed a mouthful of tea. He said, "What's so good about being a lowly scholar? There's no rank and you're ordered around all day, it's boring. If you want to be an official, you should at least be a county magistrate. At the very least, you should be a county lieutenant. What's the point of being a scholar? If you want to have a foothold in this world and not be bullied, you have to know how to hug someone's thigh. But rather than hugging someone else's thigh, it's better to be someone's thigh yourself." There was no need to be a high-ranking official. Even if it was a small county magistrate, at least he would not be bullied. As for being a scholar, he had never considered it. A county magistrate is directly appointed by the emperor. It's a 7th-ranked official position. If you want to be a county magistrate, why don't you try your best to pass the imperial examinations? Even the 8th-ranked county lieutenants have passed the imperial examinations. You're just a small elementary scholar. You don't even have the qualifications to register with the Ministry of Personnel. Naturally, you won't be able to become a county magistrate. Emingzi looked at him and said calmly. This time Li Yi did not speak. He was just saying it casually. With his lazy personality, if he were to really be in charge, he would only find it interesting in the beginning. After a long time he would definitely be bored. Chapter 144. The charcoal fire was burning brightly under the stove, and steam was bubbling out of the pot. Li Yi put the thinly sliced mutton into the pot. After it was scalded by the soup, it quickly flipped over. Just as he was about to reach out his chopsticks to pick it up, a shadow suddenly flashed before his eyes and snatched away the mutton that he had just placed in the pot. Li Yi glanced at Lu Rui. In terms of hand speed, he was still not comparable to Mississippi Lu. Seeing that she was the one who cut the mutton today, he would not argue with her over such a small matter. He picked up another piece of mutton that was as thin as a piece of paper and dipped it in the seasoning bowl that he had prepared beforehand. It melted in his mouth. To be able to cut the mutton into such thin pieces, Mississippi Lu's knife skills were indeed worthy of her reputation. Of course, hot pot could not be eaten without spicy food. He did not find a place that sold chili in the market, but fortunately there were all kinds of seasonings here, so he found a substitute. Although the spiciness was still not comparable to chili, he could only make do with it. Xuanhuan, add some tofu. Alright, add some vegetables too, and also mushrooms, carrots. Li Yi instructed the maidservant while taking a sip of fruit wine. Although eating hot pot in autumn was not as enjoyable as eating in winter, Li Yi, who had been itching for it for a long time, could not wait that long. Husband, eat slowly. No one is going to fight with you. Lu Rui said in amusement as she watched Li Yi pick up a piece of tofu from the pot and put it into his mouth. He was so hot that he sucked in air and did not want to spit it out. Why is no one fighting with you? Li Yi glanced at Mississippi Lu, who was sitting opposite him. His hands did not stop moving and he scooped up the mutton that he had just placed in the pot. It would be winter in 2 months, and there would be many opportunities to eat hot pot in the future. It was necessary to instill in Mississippi Lu the etiquette of eating hot pot. It was very impolite to take away something that was deliberately placed in the pot. Eating hot pot was actually about the atmosphere. The whole family gathered around the small stove and chatted while eating. The young maidservant had not been with Li Yi recently. It was not easy for her to have a chance. Once she opened her mouth, she could not close it again. Fong came over because of the smell. As soon as he pushed the door open, he couldn't help but swallow his saliva. His eyes were glued to the hot pot in the middle of the room. Fong is here. Xuanhuan, go add a pair of chopsticks for Uncle Fong, Li Yi said to Xuanhuan. How can I accept this? Fong's face revealed his signature silly smile again. With a face full of embarrassment, he moved a small chair and sat beside Li Yi, waiting for Xuanhuan to bring him a pair of chopsticks. After fishing in the pot, nothing came out. His smile froze on his face. Oh, I'm sorry, the dishes are all gone. If only you had come earlier. Li Yi looked up at Fong and asked tentatively, would you like to drink some soup? There was still a bit of mutton left and the dishes were not finished. Seeing Li Yi add soup into the pot, and the meat and vegetables were all in the pot, Fong's face revealed a happy expression again. While waiting for the dishes to be cooked, Fong took out a translucent object from his bosom and handed it to Li Yi, saying, Son-in-law, the soap you mentioned last time seems to be done. Take a look and see if it works. Looking at the square object in Fong's hand, Li Yi's eyes couldn't help but light up. In this era where the poor commonly used honey locust beans to bathe, to have a piece of soap was a very happy thing. Some time ago, Fong bought some alkaline flour and lime, and used saponification to make a batch of soap. The cold-made soap needed nearly a month to mature before it could be used. During this time, Li Yi was busy with Rui's due, so he asked Fong to count the days and inform him when the time was right. Having just finished eating the hot pot, it was inevitable that his hands were a little greasy. He couldn't wait to get some water, and after rubbing the soap in the water, a layer of rich foam appeared on his hands. This was the advantage of handmade soap. There was a lot of foam, strong decontamination ability, and at the same time, it had an amazing cleaning ability without causing any damage to the skin. When Li Yi made the first batch of soap, he didn't add any messy things in it. Although it didn't look good, it was very practical. After rubbing the foam on his hands for a while, and then rinsing it with water, there was no longer any greasy feeling on his hands. Son-in-law, what is this? Xuanhuan blinked her curious eyes and looked at the soap in Li Yi's hands. She was very curious about this thing that could produce foam. And this is called soap. It's used to wash your hands and bathe. It's much better than bath beans. So it's pancreas. The servant girl nodded as if she understood. What pancreas? Can pancreas be compared to my soap? Li Yi pinched her little face and said, I just finished eating the hot pot. There's a smell on my body. Go and take a bath. Xuanhuan doesn't have a smell. The servant girl stretched out her sleeve and smelled it. She muttered and ran to the kitchen to boil water. When Li Yi turned around, he found that Mississippi Lu was playing with bubbles. She seemed to be very interested in the soap. Li Yi's first piece of soap was mercilessly confiscated by her. She would bathe every day after she came back from cultivation. This soap was obviously better than bath beans. Seeing that he couldn't beat her, Li Yi didn't argue with her. The first batch of soap was about 10 pieces. He kept some at home and gave the rest to Fong and the others to divide. The soap he made didn't add any chemical stabilizers, preservatives. Of course, even if Li Yi wanted to, he didn't add any. Under normal circumstances, it could only be used for about a year. According to the tutorial in the book, he actually made it in one go. Next, he would make some in small batches, improve the process and add some essential oils and spices to it. Then it would be the real soap. As for the current product, it could only be called soap. If he added some sulfur, it would be sulfur soap. It had a certain effect of killing germs and pests and could prevent diseases. In this era where hygiene awareness was still very low, it had a higher practical value. Rui's soap had been retired for a long time. It was time to introduce a new product. This time, Li Yi planned to take the low-end and high-end routes. The ordinary soap would be sold at a lower price, and the scented soap would be slightly more expensive, going the route of the aristocracy. Of course, the fragrance could also be customized, but the price would be higher. Covering both the low-end and high-end markets, the profits would probably be higher than Rui soap. However, because the production period was too long, it would probably be next year before the soap could be officially sold. With the help of the other shops, the business of Rui soap gradually decreased after 2 days. There were a few girls and Fong in the shop to take care of it, so he didn't need to worry. He hadn't left the mountain for 2 days. When he had nothing to do, he practiced martial arts, told a few adapted fairy tales to the little maidservants, or found some interesting books in the library to recharge himself. His days were very leisurely. It was late at night, and the Willow Leaf village was very quiet. Hundreds of miles away in the imperial palace of Jingdu, in a magnificent palace, it was also quiet. Chapter 145. Occasionally, the sound of paper flipping could be heard in the frighteningly quiet main hall, interspersed with a few light coughs. Right now, the most powerful person in the Jing kingdom was putting down a memorial that had been sent from the northern border. His dignified face showed signs of fatigue. The disaster year has just passed. The flood in the south is beginning to appear. The problem of banditry in the northwest is still unresolved. The Qi kingdom is ready to make trouble and wants to invade the border of the Jing kingdom. Am I really not a good emperor? Why does God want the people of the Jing kingdom to suffer so much? After reading several memorials in succession, all of them were worrying matters. The man muttered a few words. For a moment he didn't know whether he should continue reading or not. At this moment the door of the palace opened quietly. A stooped figure walked in silently. It was an old man with a face full of wrinkles. His face was white and beardless. He wore an ordinary gray robe. He walked up the steps and stood in front of the wide table. He said in a low voice, "Your Majesty, concubine Yen has returned from a visit today. She is waiting outside the hall." There was a trace of femininity in the old voice, but no emotion could be heard. "It is very late. Go tell her that if there is anything we can talk about it tomorrow." The man heard the words and waved his hand. At this time he was annoyed and did not want to see anyone. He did not even want to see his most beloved empress. Naturally, he did not want to see concubine Yen. The old man nodded and quietly retreated. After a while he came back again and presented an item in his hand. He replied, "Your Majesty, concubine Yen has returned to the palace. She sent me to present this item to your Majesty. This item is called Ruidu. Concubine Yen brought it back from a visit. It is said that it has the effect of dispelling fatigue." Emperor Jing took the small porcelain bottle from his hand. When he was about to open it, the old man said again, "Your Majesty, the origin of this item is unknown. Should we let the Imperial Physician Bureau examine it first and then?" Emperor Jing waved his hand and said, "It does not matter. This is her kind intention. Besides, concubine Yen will not harm me. By the way, how should I use this item?" "Her Highness, concubine Yen, said that you can drip this on your hand," the old man said. He had personally tested it just now. When this thing was dripped on the body, it would indeed emit a strange smell. It could slightly stimulate one's spirit, and it could also be considered to have the effect of dispelling fatigue. Based on his decades of experience, this thing was not poison. Of course, if this thing needed to be taken to be effective, he would not let His Majesty take the risk, regardless of whether concubine Yen had good intentions or not. The man opened the lid of the porcelain bottle, and a fragrant smell wafted out. When he heard that some students were using Ruidu to study, Li added a little more peppermint to the Ruidu. Since they wanted to be refreshed, he would let them be refreshed. He had not followed concubine Yan's instructions and dripped the thing on his hand, but he already felt a little clearer. A strange look flashed through Emperor Jing's eyes. He murmured, "This thing is strange. Concubine Yan's hometown is in Qin and Prefecture, right? I will add this item to the tributes of Qin and Prefecture and send a batch every month." Since it had the effect of dispelling fatigue, he put the porcelain bottle aside and reached for the next memorial. After opening it, he smiled and said, "What a coincidence. This memorial was sent by the prefectural magistrate of Qin. The memorial was very long, with more than 1,000 words. He read it for a full quarter of an hour. After he finished reading, a trace of a smile finally appeared on his face. He said, "Rules for Disciples. It is really a superior Mongolian text. Such an article was actually written by a scholar. If those old fellows in the Directorate of Scholars read it, they would be so ashamed that they would not have the face to see anyone." He picked up his brush and wrote the word approved. This meant that Prefectural Magistrate Dong wanted to implement this Mongolian text in Qing and Prefecture, and he had approved it. Although compared to the things he was worried about, this was only a small matter, but it was still one of the few pieces of good news. It caused the haze in his heart to slightly dissipate. Of course, as for the name of the scholar, he only glanced at it and did not take it to heart. If this article was really implemented, then the scholar could be considered to have been enlightened. However, he was only a scholar and was not worthy of the emperor personally rewarding him. The local authorities would naturally do such things. Seeing that the man's mood seemed to have improved, the old eunuch's cold expression also softened. He took another step forward and said, "Your Majesty, Princess Yongla has sent a letter." "Oh Yongla, that girl, you finally remembered her father?" A smile appeared on Emperor Jing's face. Hearing this news, all of his worries were thrown to the back of his mind. He said, "Where is the letter? Show it to me." The old eunuch took out a letter from his sleeve. No one knew how many things could be hidden in his sleeve. When he took it out the second time, he actually took out a small jar of wine. He said, "Your Majesty, this was also sent by someone from Princess Yongla." Seeing this, Emperor Jing stilled slightly. He took the jar of wine. After opening it, a thick fragrance of wine wafted over. Just by smelling it, he knew that this wine would not be bad. The old eunuch at the side couldn't help but gulp. When he was inspecting the wine just now, he couldn't resist secretly taking a sip. Even now, the strong taste was still lingering in his mind. Good wine. Fiercely drinking a mouthful of strong wine, Emperor Jing's eyes brightened. He praised, "Yongla, that girl still knows what I like." She eagerly opened the letter. Part of the content was about the governance of Qing and Fu. Emperor Jing smiled. With her there was no need to even send an imperial censor. After that, it was the greetings between father and daughter. Yongla's temper was a bit stubborn, but she had been sensible since she was young. She won his favor the most. Even though they were in the imperial family, the relationship between father and daughter was still very deep. When he read the end, Emperor Jing's expression froze. He showed some shock and murmured, "Anxi County military officer. Li?" Seeing this name, a trace of confusion appeared on his face. In the next moment, he seemed to remember something and flipped open the memorial again. A moment later, a look of realization appeared on his face. Yongla actually admires this person so much. Never mind, let her do as she wishes." Emperor Jing murmured a few words and suddenly said, "Changda. This old servant is here," the old eunuch said in a low voice. "Draft the edict. Tomorrow have someone send this edict to Qing and Fu." Emperor Jing was in a good mood that night. He finished writing the edict and looked at the unfinished memorial on the table. He waved his hand and said, "I will approve these tomorrow." The old eunuch heard the meaning behind his words and said, "Where will your Majesty rest tonight?" Emperor Jing thought for a moment and said, "Announcing Peace Palace." Announcing Peace Palace, Concubine Yan's residence. Chapter 146. Outside the Announcing Peace Palace, the old eunuch named Changda looked at the imperial edict in his hand with a hint of doubt in his muddy old eyes. It was really strange that a mere secondary class 8 county lieutenant could be rewarded by the emperor himself. Soon, the doubt on his face disappeared. The emperor's heart was hard to predict. He only needed to pass down the edict. As an official of the emperor, he had served 2 generations of emperors and was very clear about what he should do. He looked back at the palace in the night and the old figure disappeared under the palace wall. He didn't know if it was a psychological reason, but he didn't feel anything when he washed his face before. These days he washed his hands with soap in the morning and felt much more refreshed. Although the homemade soap looked a little ugly, it was very useful. Ever since he knew that Xuanhuan used this thing called soap to wash her face in the morning, the few pieces left for Fang and the others were all snatched up by the women in the village. Fang didn't feel anything about it. He just got a basin of water in the morning and washed his face carelessly. Only women and the son-in-law would be so fussy. He only left 1 piece for his mother-in-law and gave the rest to the younger girls. He heard from the son-in-law that he would make a soap with a fragrance in the future and call it fragrance soap. Fang didn't understand why the son-in-law was always fiddling with these things for women. He was a man, but why didn't he have any manliness? Standing in the courtyard early in the morning, waiting to go to the shop with Li Yi, Fang saw him rubbing the soap until his hands and face were covered with it. He accidentally dropped the soap on the stool. Fang shook his head helplessly and let out a long sigh. Son-in-law. Li Yi had just washed the soap off his hands when he suddenly heard Fang's voice. "What's wrong?" Li Yi raised his head and looked at him. "You dropped the soap." Fang pointed at the soap that Li Yi had accidentally dropped and reminded him. Clang. The copper basin on the stool was also accidentally touched by Li Yi and fell to the ground, splashing the water on his face. In the shop, the four girls could already take charge of the shop. Li Yi was happy to be free. If he wanted to go to the shop, he would. If he did not want to go, he would stay in the stockade village. He would tell stories to Xuanhuan, talk with Rui about life's ideals, practice martial arts when the weather was good, and fantasize about when he could fly in the sky like Mississippi Lu. Li Xian would occasionally go to the shop to voice out his doubts. There were many problems that were difficult to explain to him according to the current scientific understanding. Li Yi could only subtly instill some thinking methods such as deduction, induction, analogy and so on. He had already given him the stepping stone. As for whether he could break the door of science with this brick, it still depended on his luck. In the meantime, Li Xian also had Li Yi draw a painting for him. More accurately, it was for Wang Fei. Wang Fei's birthday was approaching, and what gift to give was a problem. Ning Wang Fu didn't lack anything. Li Xian had racked his brains for this matter. Gift calligraphy and paintings? Mother didn't like it. Give jewelry? Would the dignified Wang Fei lack jewelry? Rare treasures? That would have to be something. After thinking for a long time, the crown prince decided to find another way. The painting that Li Yi had drawn for him last time, he had shown it to Wang Fei like it was a treasure. At that time, Mother seemed to be very interested in the painting. If he could also draw a painting for her, he might be able to create a surprise. Since it was a surprise, he couldn't draw it in front of her. It didn't seem good to bring Li Yi to the Wang Fu to peep at his mother. He could only pick a painting from the Wang Fei's previous paintings and let Li Yi compare it to the painting. This was not difficult for Li Yi. The paintings in this world were the same as other books. He could copy them into his consciousness and draw them out without any mistakes. All he had to do was use some three-dimensional painting techniques. Li Xian's idea wasn't bad. There wasn't a woman who didn't want to keep her youth. Wang Fei wasn't young, but she wasn't even 40 yet. Adding on the fact that she took good care of herself, she only looked to be in her early 30s. If she and Ning Wang worked hard, she might be able to give Li Xian another younger brother or sister. Speaking of Wang Fei's birthday, when Li Xian invited him last time, Li Yi had agreed because he thought that he could give her a few bottles of ruidu. Perhaps it could be promoted in the upper-class circles of Qing and Fu. However, he didn't think that ruidu would already be popular before this. There was no need to do anything else. If he had known earlier, he wouldn't have agreed so easily. After all, he didn't belong to that circle. Other than Li Xian, he didn't know anyone else. It would be awkward to go. In his opinion, lying in the yard and sunbathing was more interesting than attending the birthday. 10 taels of silver for a painting. Li Xian was an old customer, so he could get a 9% discount. After rounding it up, it was exactly 10 taels of silver. As a son, it was not enough to just give her a painting. However, other than a painting, what else could he give her? Thinking about it, Li Xian's head hurt. After going one round, it came back to Li Yi. "Are we friends?" Li Xian looked at Li Yi, his eyes burning. "I'm just a commoner. How dare I call myself friends with your highness?" Looking at his eyes, Li Yi's heart became a little vigilant. Yesterday he gave him a bar of soap. Did he misunderstand something? One sentence interrupted Li Xian's thoughts. He didn't know what to say next. "I've always thought of you as a friend." Li Xian looked at him and said bitterly, "To be honest, since the first day we met, have I ever put on airs in front of you?" The sudden confession made Li Yi have goosebumps all over his body. He hurriedly made a pause gesture and said, "Okay, leave it to me. Don't look at me like that." After Li Xian achieved his goal, he left with a satisfied face. He didn't have to worry about anything if he handed this matter to Li Yi. Encountering such a fraud, Li Yi could only shake his head and sigh that he didn't make friends carefully. In comparison, Mingzu was more reliable. She could get a free security guard just by freeloading a few meals and a few glasses of wine. It was so cost-effective. The only thing that made Li Yi a little strange was that in the past 2 days, he always felt that Mingzu sometimes looked at him with a strange expression. Thinking about it later, he always felt that something was not quite right. Chapter 147. In the back hall of Anxi County Government, County Magistrate Liu was sitting in an old-fashioned wooden armchair, leisurely enjoying fragrant tea. Drinking tea was one of his hobbies. County Magistrate Liu didn't have many hobbies. Closing the door and having fun with his concubine in the room was one of them. Next was drinking tea. The tea was good tea, which was given to him by the county magistrate a few days ago. The county magistrate was also a tea lover. County Magistrate Lu had been thinking about his treasured tea leaves for some days, but the county magistrate had been unwilling to part with them. A few days ago, after County Magistrate Zhou was taken away by the magistrate, the county magistrate seemed to have changed into a different person. Not only did he serve good tea readily, but he was also much more humble when talking to him. Having been an official for many years, County Magistrate Lu certainly knew why the county magistrate would change like this. A few days ago, County Magistrate Zhou was found to have taken bribes and used public office for personal gain. Anyway, there were a lot of crimes. He was taken back to the magistrate's office by the magistrate, and he might not have a good life in the future. In the past, these things had seemed extremely normal to them. Of all the officials in the county government, there was probably not a single one who could be described as uncorrupted and impartial. It was harmless to accept some money and make things convenient for others. As long as the matter was not blown out of proportion, even the county magistrate would turn a blind eye to it. The county magistrate had certainly done these things. The problem was that County Magistrate Zhou, who was almost the same as him, was taken away in this way. Hearing this news, the county magistrate broke into a cold sweat on the spot. If he was found, wouldn't he end up the same as County Magistrate Zhou? After being on tenterhooks for a few days, what he worried about didn't happen. Then he was a little relieved. It seemed that County Magistrate Zhou was just a little unlucky, and it was not the higher-ups who wanted to thoroughly investigate these officials. However, although he was a little relieved, he behaved much more restrained. He didn't dare to do any secret tricks, and he kept a good relationship with the county magistrate. If there was any news from the higher-ups, he could know it immediately. Of course, County Magistrate Lu accepted the county magistrate's goodwill. At this moment, he squinted his eyes and tasted the fragrant tea. He was still thinking about what he had just done with his concubine. Suddenly, there came the sound of hurried footsteps outside the door, and a yamen runner rushed in. County Magistrate Lu raised his eyebrows. Last time County Magistrate Zhou had an accident, it was this guy who rushed in. Seeing his flustered look this time, could it be that something big had happened again? She didn't mind that he didn't knock on the door and quickly asked, "What happened?" "My lord." The runner panted heavily and said, "Someone from the front office is here. He came from the capital." "The capital?" County Magistrate Lu exclaimed. The people from the capital city did not dare to neglect and hurried to the front hall. A quarter of an hour later, County Magistrate Lu changed into his official uniform and followed two eunuchs from the palace to leave the yamen. The two of them were indeed from the capital. The imperial edict could not be faked. But they came all the way from the capital city to announce the imperial edict just to reward a small county magistrate. When did the imperial edict become so worthless? Of course, the imperial edict would not be so cheap. County Magistrate Lu had been an official for so many years, but he had only seen it twice. It should be noted that when he took office, he only held a letter of appointment in his hand. But now, a county magistrate under his command could be rewarded by His Majesty. How could he be an emperor in the future? First, there was the honorable female arrestor, whom His Excellency warned him not to offend. Later, the county magistrate was rewarded by His Majesty, who must have a powerful background. He couldn't afford to offend them. What was the point of being a county magistrate? Lead the way. Let's go to the Li family village. When they were in the yamen just now, County Magistrate Lu had investigated the soon-to-be County Magistrate Li. At this time, with a group of yamen runners, he led the two people to the Li family village to announce the imperial edict. "You don't have to go to the Li family village." A light voice came from behind. County Magistrate Lu looked back and saw a valiant figure coming out of the county office. "Prince?" When the two eunuchs looked back, their faces suddenly changed and they were about to kneel down to salute. Emingzu waved her hand to them and said, "If you want to announce the imperial edict, go directly to the Rui workshop." In the Rui workshop, Li Yi was lazy again and didn't come today. In addition to the four girls, there was only Fong, who was sitting in the corner and dozing off. In his intermittent dream, he followed his son-in-law to earn money and bought a big house. There were servants to serve him in everything. After a long time of torturing the wicked woman at home, she finally allowed him to take a concubine. In his joy, he was about to welcome Miss Hong from the Jade Courtyard back home. "Who is Li?" "His Majesty has an imperial edict. Kneel down and accept it." Suddenly, a loud roar woke Fong up from his dream. His body trembled. The big house was gone, the servants and maids were gone, and Miss Hong was gone. What are you shouting for? Go to the funeral. Having his beautiful dream interrupted, old Fong was immediately enraged. He did not even see who it was before he scolded the intruder. How dare you? How dare you? The two fair-skinned and beardless men's faces darkened. They glared at Fong and said coldly almost at the same time. As eunuchs who delivered imperial edicts, they were fine in the palace. But outside the palace, everyone was respectful and greeted them with a smile. When had they ever been scolded like this? What did this fool say just now? Go to the funeral? He dared to say that His Majesty's imperial edict was a funeral. He was courting death. County Magistrate Liu, who was following them, also felt his eyelids twitching. Where did this fool come from? How could he say such nonsense? What? Do you still want to fight? Fong was still angry because he was woken up from his sweet dream. His eyes widened when he heard the words. He took a step forward and a burst of momentum suddenly pressed over. Was it reasonable to disturb someone's sweet dream? Just now, these two guys seemed to call his son-in-law's name. Judging from their posture, were they here to seek revenge? With that thought in mind, the aura emanating from old Fong's body grew even stronger. The two eunuchs' faces changed. Then they became completely cold and said loudly, "Take him down. Those who don't know are not guilty. Those who don't know are not guilty." County Magistrate Liu waved his hand hurriedly before the yamen runners came in. He looked at Fong and said, "You fool, these two are sent by His Majesty to deliver the imperial edict. Where is Li? Ask him to come out to receive the imperial edict." Receive the imperial edict? Fong looked at the man in the official robe and the two eunuchs. He stood there in a daze and his mind was blank. Several women stood beside the counter and looked over with shock in their eyes. Where is your son-in-law? When Fong's heart was in turmoil, a familiar voice came to his ears. At home. Fong swallowed his saliva and said with a trembling voice, "You're tuning in to the Sword Dance in the Vast Sky YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.